Well, good morning and or good afternoon, whatever it is, whenever you're watching this. Welcome to another episode of DSLR Life. And this is a slightly different one, this one. I'm not doing a little field trip as such this time in terms of camping or landscape shoot, but I thought I'd address another topic today, which is that of shooting at night, shooting lights at night, particularly in the city. So recently we actually had an event at Southampton when the new West Quay shopping centre opened another part of it, and they put on what they called a festival of light. And I thought I would go and take a few shots of this. I'd seen one or two online. It is a difficult thing to do to get good quality shots at night. So anyway, I thought I would go and have a go myself at this. So a few tips, I think, along the way might well be helpful to people who find themselves looking to do this. And in this I'm going to share one or two images, not only of the Southampton Festival of Light at West Quay, but also some that I took probably about 3 years ago now at the Longley Festival of Light, which was, I thought, was actually a really good event at Longley Safari Park. And they do this every year. It tends to be packed out, and that's the nature of some of these events, is they're pretty busy, and so that means you have to take that into account when it comes to planning your shoot. I decided in the Southampton one and at Longley that I couldn't really take a tripod. There were going to be too many people there. I'd be getting in the way, and the organisers of the event, if it's busy particularly, really don't like people wandering around with tripods. So I decided that I would do this handheld, and that brings its own kind of challenges, really. This is the Southampton Festival of Light, and it's marking the opening of the new part of the West Quay shopping centre. So we've got all sorts of little lighting treats here, which are a challenge to photograph properly, and particularly without a tripod. I came without a tripod tonight deliberately. Did think about it, but I felt that it would just make it too difficult really to get mobile enough to capture all of this. And so I've set the camera on a high ISO setting to give me the best possible chance of getting some sharp shots. I imagine they've got a number of different shows that they do at different times. Just going to wait for that light to come round again. It can look quite effective when you get the bright light shining straight at the camera, and you get sort of shadows, people silhouetted and stuff. I really like this pattern they're doing. When I'm doing this kind of shoot, I would normally shoot in manual mode, which I would, to be honest, for the vast majority of shoots that I do. So when I'm shooting in really quite dark conditions, clearly, and without a tripod, clearly you're going to need to put your ISO up, and so that's very much what I did on both of these occasions. And how high you can afford to put your ISO up is going to depend a lot on the camera that you're using. I use a Nikon D800. It's got fairly decent high ISO performance, but high ISO is a relative term, and cameras are getting better and better and better at this. My camera is over 3 years old now. That's starting to feel a little bit dated when it comes to its ISO capability, but actually it's pretty decent. It's good enough for this kind of work. So typically I'd be shooting somewhere between about 2400 and 3200 level of ISO. I wanted to say something about long exposures because part of the temptation in this, particularly if you're shooting in automatic mode, one of the temptations will be for you to use a longer exposure. And this is always something of a juggling act. The trouble with long exposures in this sort of situation is it won't help with moving images. So if you've got people in the images and you want to capture some of people taking part in that event or observing that event, having a really long exposure isn't going to help. And if there is a light show that involves moving images, then again, a long exposure isn't going to help you because you're just going to get blurry images. And so long exposures are not necessarily, I'm afraid, the answer to shooting in dark conditions. It will help, however, with still subjects. So if you've got an object that is static and the lighting on it is static, then it might well be that you can get away with using a longer exposure and a lower ISO level. That depends again how steady a shot you can take, if you can balance your camera on something, or if you have got access to a tripod at the time, then that's going to make a long exposure obviously much more possible than it otherwise would be. You might want to use a long exposure if you want to remove people from a shot. I'm going to show you an example of a shot here that I took of the church that I go to, where we had a Christmas event on, and we put some candles along the pathway to the door, to the entrance of the church building. And it was quite busy. There were a lot of people moving up and down the path, and but I really wanted to photograph the building in this case and not the people. And so I used a long exposure deliberately in order to make sure that as people moved around in the image, that actually they would not show up in the final exposure because of their movement, because they were continually moving through the scene. They weren't in any one place long enough in order to record that image in the shot. Shooting in the dark inevitably is going to involve some compromises, and we've got that kind of exposure triangle thing coming on where we're needing to juggle a number of different things. So let's tackle ISO first. A higher ISO inevitably means that you can use a faster shutter speed, or you can use a narrower aperture. But it's at the expense of grain in the picture. So you use a high ISO. If I used an ISO of 6400, for example, on my Nikon D800, I know that I'd be starting to look at image results that I was not particularly happy with. So I don't tend to go up that high. So what is acceptable, again, is going to depend upon your particular camera. Let's look at aperture. The wider the aperture you use, clearly the faster the shutter speed that you're going to be able to get. And again, with a wider aperture, you'll be able to get away with a lower ISO level. But a wider aperture will come at the expense of depth of field. So you need to take into account how much depth of field you need in your image. The wider the aperture, the less of the image is going to be in sharp focus, particularly if you're using a longer lens. With a wider angle lens, that's not so much of a problem. But certainly when you're using a longer lens, if you're throwing the aperture wide open, then you're going to have to accept that there's a compromise in terms of how much of the image is going to be in focus. That might be what you want, of course. You might want a shallow depth of field for a particular effect. Just depends what you're shooting. What about shutter speed? Well, using a faster shutter speed on the face of it might be the perfect kind of solution to shooting in the dark, because a faster shutter speed means that you're going to get less camera shake, and in theory that means you ought to get a sharper image. But the faster your shutter speed, the higher the ISO you're going to need to use, and higher ISOs mean more noise, more grain, if you like, in your image. Or again, it means throwing the aperture wide open, and that will affect your depth of field. So shooting in darker light conditions, it's really this juggling act of balancing your ISO, your shutter speed and your aperture to suit the conditions that you're shooting in. So how do you prioritize these things? ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. It's really going to depend on what you're shooting. If you want to isolate an image or isolate a subject from the background, then using that wider open aperture isn't going to be a problem. You might also want to use a wide open aperture because you deliberately want to throw the background out of focus to get a nice bokeh effect, a bokeh effect, and that can be particularly effective, particularly if you've got, especially if you've got smaller light sources in the background, I find. So you might want to create that bokeh by using a wide aperture, and but on the other hand, if you've got a scene where you want as much of it as possible to be in focus, because of just the nature of what it is that you're photographing, then you're going to need to close your aperture up. When it comes to your shutter speed, that's going to again depend on the lens that or the focal length that you're using. So we've got this rough rule of thumb. Say for example, you're using a 200mm lens or zoom lens. It goes up to 200mm, and you're using its full focal length up to 200. Then you're going to need to use a faster shutter speed than if you're using a wider angle. So for example, if I was shooting at 50mm focal length, I'd probably just about manage a 1/60th second exposure time shutter speed. But 1/60th on 200mm, unless I've got some pretty reliable way of steadying the camera, I'm going to end up with, I'm afraid, probably some camera shake and a less than sharp image. So at 200mm, I'm probably going to be wanting to be shooting at a 200th of a second or so. I wanted to share a little bit about another issue when it comes to photographing in darker conditions. And to explain this, I'm going to show you a picture of a couple of members of my family. This is my son and my daughter. We're at the Longleat Festival of Light, and I've stood them in front of a rather attractive Christmas tree because I thought this would make a nice portrait setting. You might argue it's a little bit distracting, but actually I think it just helped tell the story of where we were, what we were doing, and what time of year we were doing it. Now, there's these brighter lights behind them, and so that meant if I expose for those, they're going to be a bit silhouetted. So in this situation, I actually use a bit of fill-in flash. It's very rare for me to use flash these days, and this is a rear curtain flash. So that means that the flash fires at the end of the exposure in order to freeze whatever motion there is in the picture in that last 40,000th or whatever it is of a second. And in fact, in these conditions, a tiny bit of movement of your subject can actually help. And in this particular image, I think what it has done is it's caused a rather nice kind of glow effect within the picture, but it still has that appearance of being sharp enough. Now on this particular shot, I really did compromise on this, and then the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. Again, I wouldn't want it to have shot any slower than that because I'd have had a problem then with too much blur, really. So 1/60th of a second on this particular picture, it's good compromise. The ISO level, I'll put that up on screen. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it was when I took this shot, but I'll check that out and I'll put that up on screen. But this was a bit of a compromise, and what I ended up with, and I knew I would, was at the time, was a slightly underexposed shot. But I've got enough quality coming through and enough information coming through in this, because I'm shooting raw, that I can bring back a lot of the detail without too much noise, again because I've used a little bit of fill-in flash as well. And I hope you agree that it's just brought out a really nice result. We've got this sort of softish light, despite the fact that I'm using a fill-in flash. and it hasn't flattened the facial features at all. You can still see shadows in the face. So I really took the flash setting right down, used that rear curtain flash as well, so that I just about sharpened any motion that otherwise would have been in the image. So shooting at night, it is a skill. It is something that you've just got to practice. You've got to try and you've got to try it again. And there will be times when it just doesn't work. But if you keep at it, then you'll get to a point where, as I do, normally when I'm approaching an event or a subject, I can pretty much predict now what kind of settings I'm going to need. You know, I'm probably going to be looking quite often at something like 2400 ISO, 1/60th, 1/80th of a second, maybe a bit quicker than that depending on the lens and the focal length that I'm shooting at. And I know in most cases I'm going to throw my aperture wide open to f2.8. So I hope that's been helpful when it comes to shooting in the dark, shooting these kinds of events. And thanks for watching this video so far. If you've enjoyed it or if it's been of help to you, then give it a like, give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll look forward to seeing you again in the next episode of DSLR Life. Thanks for watching.